It's like that Augustine, I think, says it's like the rivers would become thirsty or that the bread would become hungry. It doesn't make sense. And yet, this is the yearning that humanity actually has. And so if you could take us through a few moments in how the New Testament actually does the heavy lifting for this, I think we could give some helpful context for our viewers for how significant this season really is.
Yeah, absolutely. And so to backtrack just a little bit before Matthew, right? So we, in the Protestant tradition, right, we have this idea of like silence, right? There's 400 years of silence between Malachi and Matthew, but we know that the pseudepigrapha is being written in this time. So, things that like our Catholic brothers and sisters would consider inspired and holy.
Absolutely.
There's a whole grip of writing, particularly like apocalyptic literature that's talking about the summation of the problem that you present at the end of the Old Testament narrative of the Hebrew Scriptures. Where
I'm thinking of Maccabees in particular.
Yes, yeah. And so where God is going to come through and reestablish Israel. And you actually see this kind of in a historical playing out when the Maccabees actually take back Jerusalem for a time, right?
From the Greeks,
and so when we see this kind of moving forward into the New Testament, particularly in Matthew, Jesus arrives on the scene, and he's indicative of kind of this new Moses, right, in the way that he's supposed to be understood. So actually Matthew itself is oftentimes in scholarship is broken up into 5 books, right? It's broken up into 5 sections and understood kind of like a new Pentateuch that's being inaugurated into the discussion. And so Jesus arrives in this very helpless state in the same way that Moses kind of shows up on the scene, and then Herod orders the execution of all of the boys that are under 2. But what's neat is Matthew takes a moment to use this genealogy development where he kind of reminds the reader about the totality of the heritage and how it's not lost, right? And how it's not something that needs to be mourned. It's not like a forlorn understanding. Like there's a very real connection to the Davidic line of the Messiah that's coming into which Jesus is attached. And so, the wise men show up, and then they're looking for Jesus. By the way, they're not at the original birth scene, so they don't belong there in your nativity sets, but that's okay. But, they show up later, 2 years, right? And that's why Herod wants to kill all the babies. And then as Jesus grows and develops, right, you see this person. What I love the way that you really encapsulated it there, the idea of like God taking on the problem head on and eternality becoming flesh, right? I think that's the best way and the most succinct way to put it. And the idea here is like, the way that rest can only come is through the total evisceration and defeat of sin in its most ugly and fully understood form, right? And that is through Christ's death on the cross and the resurrection. And then what comes after that is this idea of making sure that we, as followers of Jesus and being part of the Jesus movement, is to ensure that we proclaim this message of rest and this kind of now, not yet distinction of where God has come to earth. The reckoning has begun there in terms of the restore. Like, God didn't come to earth to take us to heaven and then to abandon this place. That ultimately, in Revelation, at the end of the book, we're going to be back in that restored heaven and earth, right? And so it's almost back to the garden where we started, in this idea. Right. And so there are these, it's a beautiful bookend, I guess, to the narrative where it's like eventually we will find rest in new creation and what that looks like. And so we, through our journeys with Christ now, from Acts on, experience moments of this through a process called sanctification, which is a really fancy church word of being basically saying like you're being made to be more like Jesus, right, in a daily kind of occurrence. And so that becomes our goal, as to be people who practice this idea of being made holy or being made like Christ there each day that we live this side of the grave and this side of eternity. And then our job, our hope, our call is to make sure that we extend that out to other people as well.
Absolutely. I saw in an image recently, and it's based off of this portrait where you have the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, and you kind of have this, almost like these halos around them. It's a pretty famous image. And in this portrayal of that, it was the same image, but rather it was what seemed to be a homeless family. And it was a father, son, and the mother. It portrayed that way. And what I would want to encourage us and our viewers to take into account is how in this time of need, how important it is to realize that when God becomes a man, he is not only dignifying those who are going to believe in him, for example, but he is dignifying every single bearer of his image.
The whole of humanity.
Exactly. All of humanity is being is going to be remade and is being dignified. And that's so important as a reminder when we think about those who hunger, those who have need, and the yearning and the deep groans within us in this time, which are being made more obvious, right, in this season.
Well, I mean, that's Romans 8 in a nutshell, right?
Exactly.
Paul writes about the yearning of creation.
Exactly.
For sure.
And that we can see Christmas this season, we can see the incarnation as the single most restorative thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and what's important to know is, like, Christmas is kind of part of this fundamental ordering of things where it's like Christ had to be born before he could die. Right. And our job of that is, like, as we choose to become more Christ-like each day, there's a kind of a birthing process, again, that happens as we continue to step into and live from the new nature that Christ has instilled us with. But beyond that, we get to be people who help usher in the eschaton. So what this means is, like, we get to be people who help usher in the idea of this restored creation by participating and being intentional with this idea of yearning that you're talking about, right? It's like God calls us to be people who meet the needs of the whole of humanity around us, irrespective of religious conviction or lack thereof. And we get to kind of be a temporary solution or a fix or maybe a step in the process of, like, helping satiate that yearning feeling when we genuinely step up and step outside of ourselves to participate in that.
That's exactly right. And so that's our encouragement for you guys in this time of Advent, which signifies the time of where the Christian society, the Christian church, is intentionally acknowledging this posture of yearning and waiting. We want to continue to acknowledge and encourage all of the needs that we see around us.
Absolutely.
Because ultimately, that is the biggest reflection of what the giver has given us, which is his own son.